Welcome to my presentation of my theoretical scholarly portfolio for the MSE in Literacy Education. I'm excited to share with you what I have learned, the research I have done, the artifacts I've created, and the things I've accomplished. Hi, I'm Whitney Hamilton. I teach 9th and 10th grade English at Warsaw High School. My literacy passion is helping students find enjoyment in reading. I decided I wanted to become a reading specialist when I encountered secondary learners who had fallen through the cracks, so to speak, and couldn't read well, and I didn't know how to help them. This happened my very first year of teaching. I was given literacy enrichment classes and just didn't have the strategies and the tools to help those students in the way that I would like. Those who are training to be a secondary educator get more training in the field than in education itself. So a science teacher is an expert on scientific topics but may not know as much about teaching. Not to say that they don't get any education, but we are more experts in our field. So there I was, an quote-unquote expert in literature and determining themes and working through literary elements, and I was ready to do that with my students, but a lot of my students were not ready for that higher level literature, and I was not prepared from my coursework to help students who were not good readers. So that's why I'm here, and I hope that through this program and all the things that I've learned, that I will now be better able to serve all learners, K through 12, but my heart will be with those secondary learners, and I hope that I can be a benefit to my students and my schools and my district in that way. My portfolio begins with Standard 2 Curriculum and Instruction, and the tagline that I've created for this, what it really boils down to, is where the needs of students are met. Literacy professionals are expected to use foundational knowledge of literacy best practices to meet the needs of all students, with special attention to learners who experience difficulty with literacy. Candidates must be able to provide effective instruction, which includes whole group, small group, and individual instruction. Additionally, candidates must be able to select and adapt evidence-based instructional approaches as best fits the needs of students, provide scaffolding, and implement supplemental and intervention programs. As experts in the field, an effective practitioner should also be able to be in collaboration with other teachers to make sure that effective literacy practices are implemented throughout the school and district. The two artifacts that I've included for Standard 2 are Clues to Theme, a unit of study that I created that includes notes, slides, lecture, and graphic organizers for the 6 clues to theme. From there, those organizers can be used with any different text. I also included a research PowerPoint that I created as professional development to give for teachers at the school that I was specifically teaching at that point, which was a small private homeschool co-op type of school, and that PowerPoint gave them research-based approaches to teaching cross-curricular writing. Now here's an image that shows all of the graphic organizers for each clue to theme. Obviously this is kind of meant to just be a broad overview type of image, but you can see that there's an organizer for title, plot and conflict, character, symbol, setting, important statements, and an inference chart where you look at background information plus text clues. This is a closer look at just one of the graphic organizers. There's not any particular organizer that's more important. All of those literary elements can be used to help a student determine theme. So you can see that you have questions about each literary element, and those are going to differ based on what element you're looking at, and a space to write down your answers based on the text. And then there is also an area to write about the potential theme based on what the student has found in the text. My knowledge base for the standard includes some information from Bayan Carosa and Snow's Reading Next, a Vision for Action and Research in Middle and High School Literacy. Bayan Carosa and Snow call for direct, explicit comprehension instruction, text-based collaborative learning, and intensive writing. And then my research PowerPoint included writing instruction references from Calkins and Ironworth and Burns. Those are the sources that I use to actually give specific research-based strategies for teaching writing. Both artifacts meet Element 2.1 because they were designed to meet the needs of all learners. Graphic organizers help visual learners, and the PowerPoint pushed for evidence-based writing practices. The artifacts meet Element 2.2 because the research PowerPoint was intended to encourage the use of writing throughout all of the academic disciplines. Research writing assumes the use of informational texts as specified in this element. Evidence-based instructional strategies specific to writing were used as part of the project. These artifacts could be adapted for supplemental instruction, and the research PowerPoint expresses the need for explicit instruction on writing, which meets Element 2.3. Element 2.4 is met because the PowerPoint was created as a professional development and or coaching tool in order to get all teachers in the school on the same page with how to teach research writing across the disciplines and what expectations to have of students in their writing. The research PowerPoint introduces research-based instructional approaches for teaching writing, which shows competency in the use of instructional approaches. I have developed multiple materials such as PowerPoint and graphic organizers for clues to theme, which demonstrates competency in the use of materials. The goal of the research PowerPoint was to increase the amount of writing at Applewood Christian School, which would lead to a more balanced literacy curriculum. And the clues to theme unit and even the writing instructional approaches could be applied to both whole group and small group instruction. The clues to theme focuses on reading and interpreting text, but could also be used for writing about literature. And the research PowerPoint was meant to increase writing, so competency in reading and writing is demonstrated. Inferring with text clues from Goodvis and Harvey could be adapted to teach younger students inferencing skills, which are foundational to later determining theme at the secondary level. So while Clues to Theme was written specifically for secondary learners, it could be used to impact student learning K through 12. The research PowerPoint did have an impact on student learning at Applewood Christian School. I was a member of the academic committee, and though I was not able to present this PowerPoint as professional development as originally intended, I presented the information to the academic committee, and we decided as a committee to purchase Grammarly and to encourage teachers to include more writing in their curriculum. My plans for the future to increase my effectiveness in Standard 2 include to pursue further interventions for students with IEPs. Now, at my district, we usually do not have a lot of students with IEPs mainstreamed into the regular education classroom, but this year I had quite a few more than I have in the past. Now, when I wrote this, I had plans for this to happen this year, and COVID-19 got in the way of that. But hopefully next year, if I continue to have students with IEPs in my classroom, I would like to take a look at what their strengths and weaknesses are, talk with their case manager, do other assessments as needed, and then find interventions that match their weaknesses, perhaps in the Caldwell and Leslie book, and implement those for those students. I would also be interested in starting a cross-curricular book study, perhaps Teaching with Poverty in Mind by Eric Jensen or Making Thinking Visible by Richard Church and Morrison. Both of those books I think would be great for the demographics that we teach and would also be appropriate for teachers of any discipline area. Moving on to Standard 3, Assessment and Evaluation, which I've given the tagline Assessment Drives Instruction because assessment has to be used for something. It can be defined as the process of collecting, synthesizing, and interpreting information to aid in decision making. So it's not taking tests just to take tests, obviously. Assessment and evaluation is an important part of literacy education because it provides educators with the data needed to make instructional decisions that will benefit all students. It is the assessment data that drives decisions about what levels of intervention are needed for various students. When assessments are chosen with intention and interpreted by a knowledgeable professional, assessment data is a powerful tool for solid literacy practice and even reform. Literacy practitioners need to be knowledgeable in the validity and reliability of and the purpose of various assessments. They need to be able to explain results and uses to stakeholders such as other teachers, students, parents, and administrators. They need to be able to assist others in the administration of tests. They should have a role in choosing the assessments that are used. The artifacts I've chosen for this standard are the Individualized Instruction Plan. I administered a battery of assessments to determine the reading and writing strengths and weaknesses of a 5th grade male, and then I wrote a plan explaining the results and suggesting interventions. Similarly, with the Student Longitudinal Plan, a fellow MSc candidate and I gave a 4th grade female a battery of assessments for reading and writing strengths. We taught lessons on reading strategies, and we read with that student. The assessments that were used for the IIP were the Qualitative Reading Inventory, 6+1 Traits Writing Assessment, and Monster Spelling Assessment. The Student Longitudinal Study used those assessments and more, including the TOLD 1-4, Test of Oral Language Development, Intermediate, the Yop-Singer, the Eckwald-Shanker, Test 5, Goodman's Assessment of Spelling in Self-Generated Writing, and Goodman's Miscue Analysis. The Qualitative Reading Inventory was developed by Leslie and Caldwell and is an accepted informal reading inventory, or IRI, in terms of its reliability and validity. The consensus based on the findings is that the QRI are sensitive to immediate change and long-term instructional interventions. Thus, researchers may use the QRI as outcome measures of instructional research. Now, the QRI can be paired with Caldwell and Leslie's intervention strategies to follow informal reading inventory assessment. These two sources were the basis for the Individualized Instruction Plan, as well as a big part of the Student Longitudinal Study. The use of such assessments to identify student ability and then implement instruction to help the student achieve more is based on Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, which is the theory that instruction targeted in the areas of learning that the student can learn with the help of a more knowledgeable other is essential to the student in order to develop skills they can ultimately use on their own and continue to grow and learn. Now, for the Student Longitudinal Study, we used the CAFE book for the lesson plans that we created to guide our students. Buchan states that Boucher and Moser's The CAFE Book Strategies are based on the gradual release of responsibility model, and this model is supported by various theorists including Piaget, Vygotsky, Bandura, and Wood, Bruner, and Ross. For both artifacts, multiple assessments were used to get a full picture of the students, as different assessments had different purposes. This meets element 3.1 of the standard. Both artifacts also included administering assessments, analyzing data, and recommending interventions, and the longitudinal study was written in collaboration with a colleague, and this meets element 3.2. Both artifacts were part of professional learning experiences to assist teachers in administering, analyzing, and interpreting assessments. Multiple data sources were used, and both artifacts include a plan for instruction and intervention, which meets element 3.3. And assessment results were communicated through written reports, and the longitudinal study was actually submitted to the classroom teacher of the students in question for instructional purposes, which meets element 3.4. In regards to the competencies demonstrated by these artifacts in instructional approaches, materials, supporting of whole group and small group instruction, reading and writing, and balanced curriculum, research-based instructional practices were provided in both artifacts based on assessment findings. Multiple assessments were utilized, and resources were suggested in the written reports to help with student intervention. There were a variety of assessments used to determine reading and writing proficiency, and the interventions communicated for individual students could be used by the classroom teacher as part of whole group instruction or small group instruction. The IIP was written for one incoming 5th grade student, and the Student Longitudinal Study was written about one incoming 4th grade student. However, the knowledge base and skills from the creation of these artifacts has the potential to impact student learning far beyond just those two students. The strategies and interventions found in Caldwell and Leslie's book, Intervention Strategies to Follow Informal Reading and Inventory Assessment, So What Do I Do Now?, could be applied to students K through 12, and the experience that I gained in pairing intervention to student need through these experiences would help me be able to choose appropriate interventions for students based on assessment at any grade level. Also, as a secondary educator, I had previously not had much experience working with younger students. Both artifacts required me to work with upper elementary students through the administration of assessments, as well as teaching experiences during the practicum. This experience has allowed me to build confidence in working with younger students and gain a better understanding of appropriate instructional approaches, assessments, and materials to use with that age group. Also, the student longitudinal study during the practicum gave me experience collaborating with colleagues to make instructional decisions based on assessment data. My plans for future effectiveness in Standard 3 assessment and evaluation really focus on the assessment to instruction process and how that can benefit both individual students and classes as a whole. My district recently purchased Study Island. Study Island provides students with practice for the state end of course exam at the end of 10th grade English Language Arts. While I'm not a fan of, quote, teaching to the test, this program could be used as a tool in the assessment to instruction process. The program allows for shorter assessments of specific standards, and the questions are modeled after the types of questions found on the EOC exam. In the future, I would like to use these assessments as pre-tests to determine student instructional need in specific areas of study or specific standards. There is enough testing material through the program that it could also be used for post-testing as well to track student progress and the need for reteaching or intervention. And right now our district is actually focusing on the development of common assessments and the use of data-driven instruction. I would also like to employ the use of the 6+1 writing traits rubrics on some of our writing assignments. Now, at the secondary level, this is not feasible to use all the time with a rubric for every trait. While this provides an amazing amount of information about student writing ability and levels, it's just not feasible to do with 60 to 80 essays for every essay. But I would like to, for certain writing assignments, pick which trait we want to focus on and which trait we want data on, and utilize these wonderful rubrics to learn a little bit more about our students and use that information to guide instruction in the future. Standard 4 is diversity and equity, and my tagline for the standard is culturally responsive education to meet student needs. Standard 4 is perhaps the closest to my heart, though in some ways it could be argued that I'm the least experienced and least qualified to speak on it. I've had very little real experience with diversity in the classroom and meeting the needs of diverse learners. That said, I feel very passionately that we must open our hearts and our minds to the plights of others, and it is our responsibility to help our students to do that as well. The crux of Standard 4 is culturally responsive instruction and understanding ourselves and our students as cultural beings. We must be affirming and inclusive to all learners and all cultures. The standard for literacy professionals has looked a little bit different for me than it has for many. In my career, I've only taught at schools that are predominantly white. In fact, even though the schools I attended were also technically predominantly white, I encountered more diverse cultures when I was in school as a student than I have as a teacher. The minority enrollment at the high school I attended is 27%, whereas the minority enrollment at the first school I ever taught at is 5%. What has that meant for my classroom? I still strive to create affirming and inclusive environments for all learners through the development of rapport and through curriculum that is responsive to learners. However, it is also important to me to affirm the diversity found in America, if not the classroom that's in front of me. And that is really what led to particularly my conferencing about culture artifact, which I'll discuss in a moment. The United States has always been a melting pot of cultures, and as the world becomes much more mobile and global, the concept of diversity and equity in the classroom becomes increasingly significant. My first artifact for the standard is my curriculum project, and I actually created a culturally responsive unit for my all-white classes for To Kill a Mockingbird. And I know at first thought a culturally responsive unit for all white learners may seem counterintuitive or like not a real thing, but it works. I teach in a rural, predominantly white school district with a high occurrence of poverty, and while there's not a lot of diversity found in this district, the level of poverty and the attitudes towards education were a culture shock to me when I began teaching there. So, studying culturally responsive instruction still rang true, even though I was teaching students who most would think, at first glance, I shared a culture with. I decided to create a mini unit focused on identity, couched in the much longer study of To Kill a Mockingbird. The focus here was on helping students understand themselves and their culture, and trying to help them see past their circumstances, as well as to see the similarities between themselves and others. Now, the second artifact is where we start looking into other cultures. This artifact was not actually part of my graduate coursework, although it was created during the same time frame that I was taking the Advanced Language Arts Methods course and studying culturally responsive education. I realized that besides To Kill a Mockingbird, most of my students not only were not exposed to different cultures at school, but weren't being exposed to different cultures through the reading. To Kill a Mockingbird was about as diverse as the 10th grade curriculum got. However, students were also required to read at least one book each quarter. My team teacher and I had never put requirements on those books, but we assigned some sort of book report project every quarter. I decided to develop a project for the upcoming quarter, and I decided to use it as an opportunity to expose students to other cultures. The requirements we set for their book choice was that it must be either set in a different country or be about someone of a different culture than their own. Books could have a modern or historical setting as long as an unfamiliar culture was represented. Then, instead of having students simply write or make a project in regards to their book, I decided to have them meet with other students in weekly conferences. Now, these are some example handouts for the Conferencing About Culture project. Each week, students ideally met with a different student than they had met with before, and they talked to each other about their book and what they were learning about this other culture, as guided by this weekly handout with a set of questions. Each week, it had slightly different questions. I tried to give it some sort of variety, but every week there were questions for the student to answer about their own book and the culture represented, questions to answer about their partner's book and the culture represented, and questions to answer together that required them to do some critical thinking together about both of their books. These questions generally asked them to do some sort of comparison and contrast, or find similarities between the book's main characters, or similarities between themselves and their characters. Generally, I wanted the questions to get students thinking about how, even though we can have many differences from others based on culture, we can also be similar in the things we encounter and the way we feel. Handouts are turned in after each conference and are generally graded based on completion, though I read their answers to determine what types of conversations they are having and if there's any instruction or clarification that they need on the process. Their book, concepts of culture, those sorts of things. My knowledge base for Standard 4 includes Gay, who defines culturally responsive teaching as using the cultural knowledge, prior experiences, and performance styles of diverse students to make learning more appropriate and effective for them. Gardner states that they need to be educated about other languages and cultures from around the world to see how their decisions and actions affect others, and to see how others, even others their own age, have made an immense impact on society by simply standing up for the right thing. I would say that Gay is the basis for a culturally responsive unit that is appropriate and effective for my students, even if they are not diverse. And Gardner is the basis for the Conferencing About Culture project. Both artifacts meet element 4.1 because they were created with culturally responsive instruction in mind. While the identity unit was written for a specific audience, Conferencing About Culture would work for diverse learners as well. Element 4.2, artifacts acknowledge students as cultural beings by valuing their own backgrounds and exposing them to different cultures as well. Family interviews and pair work were involved in specifically the curriculum unit, the identity unit over To Kill a Mockingbird, and that kept students interacting with people inside and outside of the school community. With Element 4.3, the Conferencing About Culture project specifically creates and advocates affirmation of all cultures through the use of literature that portrays different cultures to students. Both artifacts are culturally responsive. The Identity Unit specifically works to acknowledge the value of the culture of rural Missouri, while the Conferencing About Culture project works to acknowledge and value the diversity found in society. For Element 4.4, the teaching of these resources demonstrates to students an attitude of equity, an attitude that all learners are important and that their education matters. I've demonstrated competency in instructional approaches with these 2 units of study through the use of explicit vocabulary instruction and reading to learn. Those 2 things are used in the To Kill a Mockingbird Identity Unit. We discussed some vocabulary, some what I would call social vocabulary, with terms like identity and Jim Crow and things that just have to do with identity and society, and we used Freyer models for those. They read to learn information about the Great Depression. They journaled about what they were thinking. They did pair and small group work and class discussion and whole group instruction. I had competency in materials used. With both units, you have a varied variety of texts demonstrating a variety of cultures. We used T-charts and Venn diagrams and Freyer models for vocabulary with the To Kill a Mockingbird unit, and reading passages to build background knowledge. Both artifacts demonstrate a balanced curriculum with the use of reading, writing, speaking, and listening activities to maintain a balanced approach to literacy curriculum. Both of these projects had an impact on student learning. The curriculum project was admittedly specifically for a group of students in 10th grade, but the focus on identity could be adapted for use with younger students. And activities like the identity charts and parent interviews that were a part of this curriculum unit could be paired with age-appropriate text and have the same desired effect, acknowledging the existence and value of each student's culture. And I do want to go ahead and show you some examples of students working on those identity charts. You can see it better in this picture. They did these for themselves and for characters in the book, but the name goes in the middle, and elements of who they are as people. That can include culture, it can include characteristics of personality, physical characteristics, branch off from the name. The Conferencing About Culture had impact on student learning, which I'll go over that in a moment, what my students actually said. But this project could be adapted to any age group, I feel. You obviously would have to choose age-appropriate texts, but there's books for all levels of learning that demonstrate other cultures, so this could be used in almost any grade level. Now, my students specifically filled out Likert score surveys for me to let me know how they felt that this project impacted their own learning. I asked them if they learned about another culture from their book, if they really felt that reading the book actually taught them something about the culture. And this actually turned out to be 50-50. And I'll talk a little bit more in a moment why. For whether they learned about another culture from the book conferences, still pretty close to 50-50, although with a slight edge on the did not learn. And students, the majority, were able to find similarities between themselves and the characters from their book. That leads perfectly into the plans for the future. I have adjustments to the Conferencing for Culture project that I want to make, and those all stem from things that my students explicitly told me in those surveys. They also had the ability to type out a response on what they think should happen and what could be done better. I need to give students more explicit instruction on culture. What does that mean? What are we looking for? What types of things should be discussed when we talk about culture? I also need to revise and edit the curated list of books. Our librarian made a list of books that were in the school library for this project, which we greatly appreciated the work that she did for that. But what we found is that some of those books just barely scratch the surface of culture. Maybe just the character is from a different culture, but there's not really enough there for students to learn. And that is probably why we had these sorts of responses where only half of the students felt that they actually learned something about the culture. So we want to edit that list and make sure that every book on the list is really going to be rich in cultural information. And then some students mentioned that they wanted to or needed to do additional research on the culture that was demonstrated in their book, and so I want to add a research requirement and some activities that have students do that. As other ways that I want to be more effective in Standard 4, Diversity and Equity, I want to add more diverse whole class novels to our curriculum. As I mentioned earlier, To Kill a Mockingbird is about as diverse as the 10th grade curriculum gets. And while that's appropriate for our demographics, I do want to do some research and find some other novels that could be beneficial to my students. And then finally, again, I mentioned I don't have a lot of experience with actually working with diverse learners. And so I would like to shadow at a more diverse school. If I were to end up at a different school with different demographics, I want to be ready for that. I want to know how to work with those learners and be culturally responsive. So I would like to see how other teachers plan their culturally responsive units. Moving forward to Standard 5, which is Learners in the Literacy Environment, and the tagline I've come up with this is Literate Environment, Choice, and Engagement. This standard focuses on the need to provide a literacy-rich environment, which includes digital literacies. Literacy professionals need to be able to choose materials that motivate and engage. They must be knowledgeable in routines, grouping structures, and social interactions, and they must be able to meet the developmental needs of students. The components of access to books, choice, and engagement addressed in this standard have been a driving force in creating my classroom environment. Because student choice in reading material is so important, I've been building a classroom library full of high-interest young adult fiction for years now. I don't always end the year with as many books as I started the year with, but I am constantly trying to add new titles that will appeal to my high school students. In addition to having students surrounded by texts that they can get their hands on, I attempt to create an environment that fosters social learning. A note on digital literacies. Being a responsible literacy practitioner involves more than just students using apps. Students need to be taught how to use the technological tools they will be using for the rest of their schooling and maybe even their lives. But they also need to know what technology can be used for and how to use it effectively. The use of technology can be a tool, such as using Google Docs for writing, so that students can access their work anywhere and can collaborate with others. Or it can also be a way to access texts themselves. This new era opens up a new wave of instruction for literacy educators, from how to read various forms of digital media, determining the reliability of sources on the internet, and even just the basics of how to attach documents to email or use a learning management system. In my classroom, I've tried to incorporate all the needed digital literacies without going too far overboard. My students actually complain about using technology too much because so many of their classes rely solely on Chromebook work, to the point that it seems that teachers are using it as a crutch and aren't really providing quality instruction. I have a set of Chromebooks in my classroom, but we don't use them every day. We use them regularly, but not daily. You can see my cart right here. My school uses the Canvas LMS and I post daily lessons there, although students do not necessarily access their work there daily. We use Google Docs for writing assignments and often employ internet searches for research. I've also taught lessons on source reliability and researching using the internet. I also occasionally use digital sources as part of instruction, such as TED Talks, and you can see that my classroom does have a Promethean board. The artifacts I've chosen for this standard include the lesson refinement as part of the practicum. With fellow candidates, we developed a reading lesson using the assessment to instruction process to meet the needs of a small group of students. And afterward, we reflected on what parts of the lesson needed work and what further instruction would benefit those students. The second artifact is the language development unit, and I created a unit based on the novel Refugee by Alan Gratz using thinking routines for language development. These routines, quote, usually consist of only a few steps and provide a framework for focusing attention and specific thinking moves that can help build understanding. And that's a quote from the book Making Thinking Visible. We were to incorporate one thinking routine for each category of routines, and I chose 321 Bridge for introducing and exploring ideas, CSI, Color Symbol Image, for synthesizing and organizing ideas, and Tug of War for digging deeper into ideas. The use of the assessment to instruction process, which was utilized during the lesson refinement process, is a key part in meeting the developmental needs of many students. Lipson and Wixon state that the assessment instruction process must include sufficient time to reflect on information gathered. Indeed, the inexperienced evaluator may need to spend as much time reflecting on the information as had been spent gathering it, which is reflective of what the lesson refinement process was like for us during practicum. The thinking routines used in the language development lesson plan both provide models for student thinking and allow students to work together in various groupings to share their thinking. Richhart, Church, and Morrison state that Vygotsky, writing about the importance of the socio-cultural context of learning in providing models, stated, "Children grow into the intellectual life of those around them." Using various grouping structures, as well as allowing students to talk about their thinking, provides students with an intellectually stimulating life to grow into. Additionally, Levy and Pillerstock suggest increasing interaction for promoting positive second language learning for English learners. All of the thinking routines include a portion of working with a pair or group to provide a social, literacy-rich learning environment. Lesson refinement meets element 5.1 because I consulted with colleagues, met developmental needs of ELLs with reading difficulties, and we together reflected on the lesson, considering what steps would meet the needs of students for further instruction. The lesson refinement also meets element 5.2 because it was collaborative. We discussed what went well in the lesson and what could have gone better, and we provided various opportunities with print to engage and motivate all learners through the lesson. The language development lesson also meets element 5.2 because it includes various print and digital materials. The language development lesson plan integrates various digital technologies such as reading video as text and using Google Docs for both individual work and group collaboration. These technologies have been chosen based on their appropriateness to literacy instruction and the topics of study, as well as safety to students, and this meets element 5.3. And then finally, both artifacts meet element 5.4 because they facilitate social development through the use of various routines, grouping structures, and social interactions. Various instructional approaches are used in these two artifacts, such as whole and small group instruction, modeling, coaching, scaffolding, assessment, and closure, and then of course the thinking routines. Various materials are used, such as print texts, digital texts, and then the use of digital literacies such as Chromebook usage and Google Docs. Both artifacts include reading, writing, speaking, and listening activities in order to provide an integrated, comprehensive, balanced curriculum. Impact on student learning. Lesson refinement. The process of using assessment data to inform instruction leads to more targeted instruction and better interventions. And thinking routines could be implemented at all grade levels to be an ongoing way to develop student thinking. My plans for future effectiveness in this standard include contact with families and book clubs. At the secondary level, getting families involved is sometimes a challenge. Emails go unread and phone calls go unreturned. It is easy to become jaded and give up completely. However, I have had many positive experiences through parental contact. At the district where I started my career, we were expected to call every student's guardian at least once, ideally at the beginning of the year with something positive. Even when negative phone calls about behavior or grades were necessary, I've had many parents who were understanding and helpful. My current district is not as adamant about calling parents, and other teachers are not as positive toward the idea. However, I would like to move past the status quo of the building and get back in the habit of making parent contact a bigger part of my practice. The use of book clubs is meant to help students develop their reading identity through an increase in student choice and social interactions about books. We as a department are hoping to integrate book clubs into our curriculum next year. Penny Kittle said something at her session at Right to Learn this year that really struck me. It's not rigorous if I don't read it. For this reason, my colleagues and I feel strongly that book clubs could be a way of meeting students where they are, which is better for their growth as readers and writers, as well as their social and emotional development. Kittle also uses Flipgrid with her students as part of discussing books. Flipgrid is an education-based video discussion platform. It's a website and an app that allows students to post short videos and respond to others. Using this would be another way to integrate technology into my teaching. Admittedly, I tried to use Flipgrid for distance learning, and since I couldn't make it mandatory, I've not had any luck so far, but it's given me some practice with the platform that hopefully will benefit me next year. And finally, we arrive at Standard 6, Professional Learning and Leadership. And the tagline I've come up with for this standard is, "With great knowledge comes great responsibility." Because our ability to master, model, and advocate for quality literacy education impacts the effectiveness of the literacy programs in our entire districts. Teachers often like to say, just close your door and teach. But, like I said, with great knowledge comes great responsibility. It is our responsibility as literacy professionals and literacy experts to not just be worried about the students in our own classrooms, but to advocate for all students and to work to make sure that literacy best practices are used throughout our school and district. As for the significance in the classroom, being a reflective practitioner has a huge impact. The longer you teach, the easier it is to get into a rut and to get comfortable doing the same thing over and over again. A reflective teacher is open to change. They consider their lessons, units, rationales for what they teach, and look at whether they are effective and follow best practice. This standard is all about being reflective of professional practice, research, and policy. You must be able to collaborate, advocate, and facilitate adult learners, and you must be able to design, align, and assess practice and intervention within and across classrooms. The artifacts I've chosen for this standard are the peer coaching cycle, where I worked with 2 elementary teachers on a lesson for using context clues to determine word meanings. I researched strategies, observed the lesson, and debriefed with the teachers. I also chose the professional book review, where I considered the book teaching through the text, reading and writing in the content areas, for use as a book study or PLC resource for content teachers. I then wrote a review discussing the pros and cons of the book for such use. As a literacy professional, keeping up with professional literature, and particularly reviewing books and articles for relevancy to your district teachers, is a practical and reflective way of being a literacy leader. Moxley and Taylor state that, as a resource provider, it is essential that the literacy coach have contemporary, relevant texts for teaching reading, literacy coach reading, and references to support research-based literacy practice. As a resource provider, you should identify beneficial text for study groups as well. Moxley and Taylor indicate that today study groups using quality, teacher-friendly texts are popular. They should be easily transferred to the classroom, teacher-friendly, and developmentally appropriate to the students. And those are the things I was looking for when I did my book review. And then for peer coaching, Alan states that the teacher did need me as a literacy expert in her room. She needed a colleague, sounding board, and friend to take the plunge with her in this new teaching assignment. And that's what I like about peer coaching, is that I can come alongside someone and help them. Alan also states that coaches are not miracle workers, but rather teachers who get the opportunity to partner with other teachers in classrooms to refine instructional practices in hopes of raising student achievement. Element 6.1 is about reflecting on professional practices and being critical consumers of research, policy, and practice. I reflected on student needs and how to push students forward during the peer coaching cycle, and I reflected on student and faculty need for the book review. Doing the book review was a way of keeping up with professional literature, and I had to research strategies for coaching. Element 6.2 is about collaborative decision-making to design, align, and assess instructional practices and interventions within and across classrooms. The peer coaching cycle involved a lesson for 4th and 5th grade classes. The debriefing included both the 4th and 5th grade teachers, and vocabulary building was actually a district-wide weakness that was being addressed. The lesson was relevant. The peer coaching cycle involved developing, refining, and demonstrating leadership and facilitation skills when working with individuals and groups. And while I did not work directly with teachers in writing the professional book review, I had to consider the book from the perspective of a literacy leader and think about how I would facilitate a book study with fellow educators. The professional book review required me to consider effective literacy practices and determine if the book would be valuable on behalf of the teachers I work with. The peer coaching cycle involved researching effective literacy practices for the chosen literacy skill, advocating best practice for the sake of students, and consulting with the teachers on the best way to implement the lesson. Various competencies were met with these 2 artifacts. Peer coaching involved researching instructional approaches and deciding what best fits the purpose and objective for student learning. Various materials were used in determining best practice for teaching context clues in the peer coaching cycle, and we decided on a text and graphic organizer that would best meet our needs. The peer coaching lesson used whole group instruction as well as small group instruction. Both artifacts were created with balanced curriculum in mind, particularly across all contents and grade levels. And the peer coaching lesson was over a reading strategy, but consideration to both reading and writing was given when reviewing the PD book. The peer coaching cycle had an impact on student learning. The students grew in their ability to use context clues to determine vocabulary. The skill stuck. Later, when the school's reading groups were specifically working on vocabulary building skills, Mrs. Page, the other teacher who took part in the lesson, heard one of her students say, "It's like the lesson in Miss Schultz's class." That's so encouraging. When discussing the peer coaching cycle and the instructional approaches we used with the kids, this is what Angela Schultz, the fourth grade teacher, had to say. She said, having the kids practice it on their own, just that skill seemed to leave a lasting impression. I think it helped having another class and teacher join as well. It made the lesson seem special and important. And speaking on peer coaching as a process itself, Ms. Schultz said that peer coaching was very helpful. It was nice to have a peer observe me and give feedback and advice. It's a way to grow. As a teacher grows and really becomes more skilled, student achievement will grow too and learn more. Now, the professional book review is an example of literacy leadership, and leaders who will advocate for best practices have a significant effect on student learning. Being a leader in literacy and helping other educators grow in their use of effective literacy practices across content areas would have a marked effect on student literacy skills. My plans for future effectiveness in Standard 7 include conference attendance, specifically with colleagues, and a departmental book study. Part of being a reflective practitioner and literacy leader is staying up to date on current trends and effective practices in ELA instruction, and one way of doing that is conference attendance. I have been privileged to attend the Right to Learn conference here in Missouri 2 years in a row, and I plan to continue to attend as long as my district will let me in order to reflect on my practice and learn new ways of meeting the needs of students. Not only that, the second year I attended this year, I was able to attend with 2 of my colleagues in the English department. Attending with fellow practitioners increased the reflection and learning of the conference experience tenfold or more. Rather than just trying to absorb, I was able to discuss, listen, and sound off ideas with my colleagues, and that added so much to the experience, and it really was a great benefit to all of us. I hope to continue to attend conferences with others in my department in the future. These are some of the pictures that I took at Right to Learn this year. Now, while we were at the conference, we attended a day-long session given by Penny Kittle. We were inspired by the session and would like to implement a department-wide book study on 180 Days by Kelly Gallagher and Penny Kittle. I think a book study on this particular book will help us as a department reevaluate our practices and help us collaborate on trying new things for the benefit of our students that will lead to more student engagement. And actually, I've already started reading the book, and I would have to say that Kelly Gallagher and Penny Kittle have been some of my greatest professional influences. Their work with book clubs, choice reading, writing with students, and focusing on authentic writing has greatly changed the way I think a secondary ELA class should look. That brings us to the end of my Theoretical Applications Scholarly Portfolio. Thank you so much for your time, consideration, and dedication to the education of future literacy experts.